Hello, everybody. How are you? It's good to see you. Thank you all for coming this evening. We're thrilled this evening to give out our 8th annual UNT Rilke Prize. So this is the 8th time we've chosen a winner, and one of the things that's always struck me is that year after year this prize keeps getting more and more attention, more and more people interested. In the first year, we had, I think, 54 books submitted. And we had a great winner, but there were only 54 books. But this year, 220 books. And David Keplinger, who's going to read to you in a couple minutes, won the prize because his book stood out from all those 220 books. And I said this last night at our event on the square, but truly when the three judges, Jean Dubrow, Bruce Bond, and I, sat down to talk about the prize and to make our final decision, we spent more time trying to figure out who would be the finalists than we did who would be the winner, because we all had that book on top of our stacks when we came to make the decision. So it's a wonderful book, and I think you'll hear tonight why he won the prize. And it's for a book that's sold out. So congratulations to all of you if you got a copy of Another City tonight. If you didn't, you can buy it online, and then you can mail it to David and ask him to post-date it in his signature for you, and I'm sure he'll be fine. He'll cover the cost of shipping it to you. I think he's fine. I'm sure you're right. I mean, you've got $10,000 now, right? So, I mean, what else are you going to spend that on, right? So, and so if you're not familiar with the Rilke Prize, though, the Rilke Prize is an award that recognizes a book by a mid-career poet. And so this is somebody who's published at least 2 books previously, and somebody who's no longer, at the beginning of the career, no longer an emerging poet, which is, I think, something we celebrate in this country a lot, the emerging poets. But this is someone who has entered that mature stage of their writing and who is writing at the top of their powers. And I think that's absolutely the case with David in this book that won tonight. And it's a prize that recognizes a book that demonstrates exceptional artistry and vision. And I think, again, you'll see that and you'll hear more about that in our proper introduction that's coming. So we're thrilled that David's here to read to us. Afterwards, if you do have a copy, he will sign books up here. So come get your book signed. Now I'm going to bring up Asa Pace to give the proper introduction. And Asa is a PhD student in poetry here. And she's coming over the desk. Look at that. So impressive.
Good evening. Am I loud enough? Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce David Keplinger, the winner of the 2019 Rilke Prize for his poetry collection, Another City, published by Milkweed. David Keplinger is the author of 5 books of poetry and the recipient of numerous awards, including the Cavafy Prize and 2 fellowships from the NEA. His poems appear widely in journals such as Poetry, Plowshares, Pleiades, Coppernickel, and Ninth Letter, among others. He teaches in the MFA program at the American University in Washington, D.C. The incisive, haunting poems in Keplinger's Another City explore mortality and the indefinable connections between people by moving through spaces that are both real and imagined, physical and metaphorical, external and internal. The book's 3 sections, City of Birth, City of Texts, and City of Domes, invite us to inhabit these spaces in shifting, dreamlike ways. And despite the collection's meditation on loss and longing, there is a glowing, hopeful center to these poems. They revel in the small and ephemeral and refuse to give in to isolation even as they explore loneliness. Often by insisting on physicality, these poems create connections between the bodies and minds of seemingly far-flung figures like Simone Weil, the speaker's dying parents, and Abraham Lincoln. At his father's death, the speaker notes his unflexed, relaxed face, and later, Lincoln's imperfect embalming leaves him a grotesque green Jesus of the hour with a collapsing, melted gaze. The speaker's body collapses with the body of Simone Weil kneeling in church as he describes the ball of the knee and its heaviness on marble, the way every part of the anatomy has some corresponding other part. With compelling shifts in time and scale, these poems lead us through keyhole-sized doors and back through time to the speaker's great-great-grandfather in the Pleistocene. They inhabit the perspectives of the eye and the mouth, who chews a revelatory onion skin down to proverb size. Perhaps the most affecting quality of these poems is their ability to see both the invisible lines that bind humans together and the beauty that persists without us. As he writes, "My mother's cough could wake me up at night 200 miles away, and yet whole worlds grow in darkness with no effort from my life." Now, please join me in welcoming David Keplinger.
I did not leap over the table. Thank you, Asa. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, John. Thank you, Corey. And thank you, Lisa, for helping to make this possible. It's a really special week for me to be here with you all. And, we write these books in our private moments, poets writing books by windows, overlooking snowy fields, It's a very lonely business, writing poetry. And then to come to a forum like this and to be able to read your poetry, it really does bring out the gratitude in me in a big way. So as a way of saying thanks, I wanted to start not with my own poem, but with a poem by W.S. Merwin, who passed away last month and who was a great influence on my life. A great lover of the things of this world, the natural world, and a payer of attention. So this poem is called Thanks. Listen. With the night falling, we are saying thank you. We're stopping on the bridges to bow from the railings. We're running out of the glass rooms with our mouths full of food to look at the sky and say thank you. We're standing by the water, thanking it, standing by the windows, looking out in our directions. Back from a series of hospitals, back from a mugging. After funerals, we're saying thank you. After the news of the dead, whether or not we knew them, we're saying thank you. Over telephones, we're saying thank you. In doorways and in the backs of cars and in elevators, remembering wars and the police at the door and the beatings on stairs, we're saying thank you. In the banks, we're saying thank you in the faces of the officials and the rich and of all who will never change. We go on saying thank you, thank you. With the animals dying around us, taking our feelings, we're saying thank you. With the forests falling faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we're saying thank you faster and faster. With nobody listening, we're saying thank you. Thank you, we are saying and waving, dark though it is. It's such an amazing poem because the thank you seems to contradict what's going on in the world. There are the payers of attention and there are those who do not pay attention. And the work of the payers of attention is to say thank you. Say thank you despite whether anybody's listening or not. And I do believe that that is the work of creative artists. It's the work of poets. It's our responsibility to use attention as an act of love or as an act of gratitude. A celebration of being here, no matter what it looks like, dark though it is. So my book is called Another City, and it's a study of places, but it's also a study of states of mind. So the cities are literal, but they're also figurative. And it starts with a section called City of Birth, and there's an epigraph that actually comes from Rilke. It comes from one of his letters, which he wrote from Paris to his wife, Clara. And it talks about a feeling of being present and how rare that is, even for someone like Rilke, who, to me, was one of the most present poets alive in the 20th century. So this is what he wrote to his wife. One lives so badly because one always comes into the present unfinished, unable, distracted. I can't I can't think of any time of my life without such reproaches and worse. I believe that the only time I lived without loss were the 10 days after Ruth's birth, when I found reality as indescribable, down to its smallest details, as it surely always is. So this sense that reality is not somewhere else, that reality is here, and yet we don't see it, is something that Rilke was very aware of, and that he fell short. Makes me feel a little bit better about myself, distracted as I am. But I do believe, and I know that many of you in the room here are creative writers yourselves, I do believe that the work that we do, the practice that we do, helps us to be a little more present, a little more attentive, a little more grateful than we would be otherwise. So this is the first poem of the book. It's called City of Birth. The wound rips open. You feel the wealth of solitude, its hospital lights. Then you know you have arrived. It's to be one body and held in the palm of the doctor's hand. It's the gash of being seen. Now for the rest of your life, you're trying to be born through a wound. That's loneliness. By a slip or by some move more desperate, you've burned a purple shadow on your body. But death is not the subject of our portrait. It's the knowing you're seen. It's the lighting of one's light. It is to take a body knowing you are not the body. That's loneliness. Beatification. The only soul who beatifies itself is the lightning bug of America. Also called firefly, also called half in love with dusty death, also called slant of light, also known as hobo who believes he's Jesus. And you, O my soul, greased with luciferase, my consort, arriving on fire as Lampyridae, your flash dactylic like apple tree, crucifix, undertow. You are the one lit from inside as you venerate your life to children. And I chased you a long time through darkness, my hands thrust forward when I sealed shut my fist and squeezed. This is a poem called My Father's Hours. Asa mentioned my poems about my father. There are poems about my relationship to him and to my mother, who I lost in the course of writing this book. So it's a kind of chronicle of grief and the passage through grief. This is a piece that Seamus Heaney would say is cast in close-up because it's happening in the moment. And it's an homage to Robert Hayden, Those Winter Sundays. My Father's Hours. I went searching for a clue of some collaboration between the two who ruled that house, with its discouragement, for a glance or the morse of clicking silverware. As on the late shift nights, over the chair he hung his heavy green coat, and then his hard hat by its strap of white plastic. And like a man in an elevator falling, he would stand frozen, the work still loud in his body. What was the story he told himself coming home on these evenings? Was his life. When I met him at the door, in my pajamas of men on motorcycles, all of them helmeted, impassive, doing wheelies in the air. Now up the wooden hill, he said, and he pointed his finger at nothing. I have to tell this story. I gave a reading of this poem in Santa Fe last summer, and after the reading, a man in his 60s walked up to me, and he said, "Oh yes, I remember that green jacket your father used to wear." I said, "What?" He said, I was your father's apprentice in 1975, and I saw your name in the newspaper and came to the reading. And I remembered him then. His name was Rick, and he used to come to our house after work. But this is, incredible. So we stood and we talked about those evenings that he would come home from those late shifts. This is a little bit of a leap. It goes back to my second book called The Clearing, and it's a poem called Lorca's Passport. In 1929, Federico Garcia Lorca came to New York City. I don't know how many of you know this, but he did spend some time in the United States. He was in Newburgh, outside of the city, and he was studying English at Columbia University, but according to people who were writing about him at that time, he really didn't learn any English. He wasn't very serious about learning English. He wanted to come and experience New York City. Coney Island, King Kong, the building of the Empire State Building. He was fascinated with all things American. The beautiful spirit, Lorca. And I wrote a few poems in that book imagining him there. But I also have come to terms with my own stance in terms of what political poetry is for me. I'm more of a contemplative poet. Czesław Miłosz says that all poets are called to contemplate being, but then sometimes they're cornered by history. And I believe that now all of us as writers are a little bit cornered by history. And we have to think about what our stance is, what our politics are, and how those politics are expressed in our writing. As a contemplative poet, I do believe, though, that the politics are there, that they're reflected maybe not in what the poems say, but in how they describe what they choose to describe, how they name things, even the kinds of diction that one might choose. And I go back to this poem. It's called Lorca's Passport, which is just a description of Lorca's passport picture. And we know all of the rest about Lorca. We know that he goes back to Spain. We know that he's killed by Franco's assassins a few years later and buried in an unmarked grave. So all of that context about Garcia Lorca that we know collectively is informed in our reading of this poem. At least that's what I believe. So I'm interested in how I keep those things that I want to say hidden, and I allow the language to embody it. I allow the choices that I made in what to look at to embody it. So this is called Lorca's Passport. In the photograph, which we know the poet admired, which we know he called spiritualistic, the vague spotted bow tie, like a moth, has come to rest slightly crooked at his throat. His shirt glows, the visible portion an upside-down triangle or a lily that is open to bare his head from the dark of the charcoal buttoned shirt. One eye is shadowed, one ear is black, sucked into his hair. The ear we can see is a luminous egg. There's a pinprick in the center. The other eye's socket swallows his pupil like a mote. It borders on the light of murder, he once wrote of it. Over my shoulder, a sort of harp. I wrote a book called The Prayers of Others, which followed that second book. And it was a collection of prose poems that were really fragments. There were no titles to the poems. And then following that, I wrote some more prose poems in a book called The Most Natural Thing, which was a collection of prose poems that were exactly the same size. They were a perfect square, and each of them were 9 lines of prose. So I just wanted to read a couple of those and then get back to Another City. But this one has an epigraph from Henri Bergson. Wherever anything lives, there is, open somewhere, a register in which time is being inscribed. The hiddenness of God is necessary. God hides within the space between a thing and other things. Without this space, we have no urge to go forth, and we are here to go forth. What I discovered at the moment of my death was there is no space between a thing and other things, and God is not hidden, just as there is no going forth. We stripped and swam to the green island. It was early as summer. There is such a thing as midnight sun. Osa let me touch her from behind, her body so much older than mine. Underwater, she yelled something. What? I don't remember. What we call sorrow is merely failing memory. The assumption. From its pellet-like source, the universe widens. Our car broke down near the fairgrounds that winter. There I once saw the world's tallest man, harrowed by his ankylosis. He sat in a chair waving at us. Then he rose as if climbing a rope. 5 o'clock, just about dark, the tow truck arrived. It cranked down its hood on a chain. It hoisted the bumper, lip of a fish, almost vertical. Altogether, we climbed in the truck, the Father, the Son, the quiet driver. And this is the last poem from that collection. It's called Removal. To feel each branching outward part. I don't feel each part, though I've prayed to hear the small breath of my cells at Wet Mountain. The aspen grove sends messages in leaf coat to its heart, a clutch of roots. Mildew zones out in the provinces. Burn up, the yellow aspen says, which is another way of saying remember who you are as you move in your beautiful arched upward body, believing yourself to be your own kingdom, believing yourself to be only yourself instead of the land. And this is a poem from another city. It's called My Town. I have a recurring dream. I'm beginning to think that this is just me. I used to think that everyone had this kind of recurring dream where there is a place that I return to over and over again. And when I'm there, I know where I am. There's a mansion. It's mine. There's a huge lawn. There's a soccer field on the lawn. There's a little path along a river, and then there's a town down below. And I can recognize it when I'm in the dream. And it happened so many times over the last 30 years. There was a period when I thought, am I just imagining that I'm dreaming this over and over again? And I started to write down the dreams. So over all of this time, I decided to write a short poem that kind of cataloged the various ways I've been in my town. Another city. My town. Sometimes my town is deserted. The streets are dark except for a luminous bookstore window. Inside, a poet I loved early in my writing days. Sometimes she's talking to a younger version of herself, and they're sipping wine in unison. Sometimes I'm lost in my town, and it's raining, and I can speak only Czech. Sometimes I'm at my mansion on the outskirts. There's a soccer field. The sun is setting over it. My guests have bled out onto the lawns. Sometimes my parents are coming down the grand staircase, still dressed in their coats for winter. Hello, my father says. Hello, my mother says, in much the same way. Sometimes I'm walking toward my town along a giant wall, and below the wall is a river, and across the river is another place, a city of the dead, and it reminds me of the Tuileries. I know I have a choice to go there or keep walking to my town, which I always do, which I've done so far, with its spires and bars, its windows with motionless skeleton faces. So as I said earlier, Rilke is a great influence on me. Edward Snow's translation of the new poems was one of the first poetry books I bought on my own. Not assigned for a class, but just because I picked it up and couldn't put it down. Had a red cover, and I read those poems over and over again in the summer of 1990 after I graduated from college. And then I began to read all of the other translations of Rilke that I could get my hands on. My favorite being Stephen Mitchell's Selected, which came out around the same time. So Rilke says at one point a very mysterious thing. He says in the first Duino elegy that every angel is terrifying. Every angel is terrifying. That's not William Gass's translation. What does he mean by this? The idea of the angel in Rilke, according to Robert Haas, who writes about it so beautifully, is that it's not the angel that we imagine in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Not an angel who's rooting for us. Not even an angel who's wrestling with us, like in that story of the wrestling angel. But this is a kind of angel that stands by and watches as we struggle. It's not even watching us necessarily. It's more like it's penetrating us with an impassive kind of glance. But it sees us as we really are. And I think back to the epigraph that I read at the beginning of him thinking of his daughter, Ruth, about those days after Ruth's birth, when everything was luminous for him. And there's something about the way that an infant can penetrate you and see who you really are. And you get to this point where he says in another poem about the archaic torso of Apollo that you have to change your life. That this other has seen through you, and you have to live in a higher way or a better way. The terrifying thing is that now everything has to change. So this poem is called Every Angel is Terrifying, and it's about being seen that way, not by an infant, but by a deer. And it's a poem that I wrote many versions of. I finally got it right, I'd say about 2 years ago, but I started writing it in 2007 when I moved from Colorado to Washington, D.C., where this takes place. Every angel is terrifying. There was a time one of the younger deer stepped into the hedges at the house that we called Homewood, and through an open window, he lowered the shale-colored muscular shoulders. His eyes met my eyes and pushed partway through. I thought it was to see who was alive in here, or to offer some encouragement with his aware, impassive face. May I stay heavy on this mine, I found myself requesting. May part of me remain behind these eyes, but it did not. The herd continued down their unmown road, and the deer at the window broke his gaze and turned and followed them. This was the start of some new work for me. It was the fall. I've been trying to untangle all my questions. I wished that I was not myself. I never saw the angel after that. Time passed, nor did the herd return. I went back to what I had been doing all along, except that I could feel a certain focus, the concentration of a being standing watching what I am. So I mentioned Czech earlier. After I got out of graduate school, I left the country to teach for 2 years in a city called Ostrava, which is on the eastern side of the Czech Republic. I wanted to go to Prague and live among the other Americans in Prague and teach school there, which was really popular in 1994, just after the Czech Republic had separated from the Slovak Republic. And people were flocking there. But the only job that I could find was in Ostrava. In fact, even in a smaller town outside of Ostrava, which was called Frýdek Místek. And I got a job at a gymnasium and taught there full-time, and I taught part-time at the university. It was amazing. But I showed up not speaking a word of Czech, and because it was such a small community, Frýdek Místek, there was hardly anybody for me to talk to, so I had to learn the language fairly quickly. And there's a thing in Czech language. First they have a rolled R, which is very pronounced, R. And the R is matched with certain consonants that are unlikely for speakers of English, like H, like H and then R. H, R. So if you want to order fries at a restaurant, you have to know how to say hranolki, which is, a basic word, but very difficult. I found myself walking up and down the avenues of this town, practicing this rolled R. There's another kind of R called je. That's like R2. That's really difficult because it's r, but it's also a J sound at the front of the palate. So I had a neighbor who used to say to me, can you say Thursday yet? Thursday is chtvrtek. It's ch-t-v-r-tek. Chtvrtek. So I would say, Thursday, give it a try. No, not good enough. You're not one of us yet. And it took me about a year to become one of us in her eyes by being able to say chtvrtek. So this thing about language, that in order to be one of the crowd, I had to do these acrobatics with my mouth, became a fascinating thing for me. And I practiced, and I practiced, and I practiced. And so the language wasn't just about plain old communication. I'd like some bread. I need to go to the post office. I need to open a bank account. There was something about it that had to do with great intimacy, not just with an individual, but with a group, to be a part of that group. So this poem happens in the second section of the book, which is called City of Texts, which is a study of how texts are distant in the way that cities are distant, are experienced as distant in the book, but then the actual letters of our alphabet become characters in this section. This is called the liquid R. The letter is R. It was a language of White Hills, red brick towns. An alley was a comma in the Agony's grammar. It was the old one, tied against a chair, madness swelling like a thought too big for her head. And each death was a period. The mortician, a stain, a drop of ink in his black suit before a page-white mausoleum. It was the language of yeast soup, snowy hills, towns called beauty and cold, where the names of things had some corresponding order, beauty always going cold, always losing itself to something permanent. There was carp at the fishmonger, butcher paper where the meat was weighed, time at the clockmaker's shop. There were some tactical surprises. The headmaster turned janitor inside of a day. The ambassador seen on the subway in tattered clothes. The president dressed as prisoner delivering his acceptance speech. The secret police as tourists on their own beat. But mostly it was a language one used when speaking in a whisper, rolling the ra, practicing the ra in your mouth until it dropped from the palate to the tongue as from the pocket of God and hung there momentarily in its shiny majesty. A sound much older than the language that spent it, that offered it from one mouth to another. I'll just read a couple more. I thought maybe I would read a few new poems at Corey's request. So I'll do that. I have one more poem to read from this book, though, and it holds a dear place in my heart. I began the reading talking about W.S. Merwin, but I had a long friendship with the poet Mary Oliver, who some of you might know. Mary was really good to me early in my career. She chose my first book for a competition, and as a result, my whole life changed. We became good friends, and I would visit her in Provincetown, where she lived for many, many years. She used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and make coffee and smoke a cigarette. You can't imagine Mary Oliver smoking cigarettes, but she loved cigarettes. And she would stand in the kitchen making this, her coffee and talking to me about poetry, which was such a gift. And so one day I was sitting on this white couch by the window with, the ocean behind us. She was making coffee. The sun was coming up. And I saw that there was a package on the coffee table from Kodiak, Alaska. And I said, Mary, you got a package from Alaska. What's happening here? She said, oh, yes, that came from my friend Tom Dancer in Kodiak, Alaska. And I said, well, what was in it? She said, it's very interesting, a tiny pine cone. in that package, the tiniest pine cone you can imagine. I said, oh, wow, it's a big package, Mary. She said, yes. He wrote a letter, he sent the pine cone, and he told me the story, how he found it in a pile of bear scat in Kodiak, Alaska. I said, oh, this is amazing. So it's like the pine cone went through the inferno and out the other side, and now it's here in your living room. She said, yeah, you get it. And she said, that's why I ate the pine cone. And I said, Mary, this is why I will never be the poet that you are. Because there's something about her poetry that made her want to be of the thing, that describing it, that wrapping it in the bandages of language was not good enough, that she had to be of it to take it in her. And so when she was dying, I was writing her letters that I don't know if she read or not, because there was a time when I couldn't contact her anymore. She wasn't receiving any calls, and I didn't get to see her in the last months before she passed away. But this is a poem for her. It's called Letter from Rock Creek. I want to ask you what that clicking sound is named, rising out of Rock Creek Park below my little room. But even you can't help me pin that down. So many miles from here, where you're tucked in your bed, your little room, your neck and chin concealed by the bark of a burnt sienna scarf. So I leave it as it is, our mood music. And I remember shore days in the Provincetown house, reading in Hopkins' Send My Roots Rain, or anything by Keats, who was drowned in a ceiling made of flowers, while this click in the background persists, not cricket, some smallest insect on record, small enough to be a gnat's pilot, small like a certain quality you've courted in your poems, how you squint and bend down to things, how you don't disturb their place, how this characteristic expands in my mind as the objects themselves grow tinier, the closed hood of the mushroom's umbrella at night, or the clam and Osiris locked in its bivalves, which made a nice supper. How the god appears altered each time you look, even the scrape of one wing against the other's leathery file to stridulate, to make a click that carries in mathematical waves, while this singer, untroubled by itself, goes on fine without an advocate, a name. So here are just a couple of new poems, and then I thought if we had time for some questions at the end, I'll save a few minutes for those. Sonnet. This is after a magnificent stork's nest that I saw in a tiny town called Stare Miesto, which basically means old town. Old town. Sonnet. You aren't here. Still, this nest sits tilted slightly on the station tower, as if a satellite disk wrapped in glass, wrapped in grass, wrapped in twine, over and over, or yarn around a set of invisible hands. Old transmissions have come to a hush. Air is static oral. In your absence, I wonder at this gat, this bulrush basket, mouth in waiting for its tooth. It circles the negative space like a name. You aren't here, but here is your nest. Praise possibility's inverted dome. Praise who spun with very delicate materials the shape of emptiness. Photon. It was only until their evidence was gone that we realized with surprise that they had been here at all. Many billions draped like a sweater over the Amish chair, or traveling like pilots on flecks of dust streaming from the barn window. The horses knew and threw back their wild eyes. The roosters knew and tried to communicate to them or to us the urgency. The cats knew, but could almost care less. It was dark now, and all our eyes were closed, and the photons had left the world. Like the blessed dead, they descended, a cascading wave in William Blake. But very quietly, and so small were their movements, we hadn't noticed they were packing up to leave all along, getting their houses in order, continuously gathering. And this is the last piece that I'll read. It's called Space. Photographed from the rear view of Voyager 1, the Earth is, in Carl Sagan's explanation, a pale blue dot hanging in a brown band of light. At first, nearly mistaken for a particle of dust on the screen. There it oddly glitters like a binary sun. Even in still life, it glows as the probe leaves the solar system, now headed farther into vast, dry space where it's constantly night and a desert stretches out in every direction. There's no real plan from here. Space will pose no opposition, no wind resistance, no stoplights, no railway crossings on this route, and a long way through the valleys of Jurassic bones, the astral tar pits, and nebulae like dust devils on every side. Meanwhile, this is the story of death. Meanwhile, this is the story of going on living. Meanwhile, the Earth is still back there in the rear view, albeit getting smaller and smaller and smaller, the tiniest Las Vegas imaginable. Still full of zinging lights and action, full of coming into life and dying, all contained inside the speck. Much smaller than a molecule by now, smaller than a subatomic particle. Its endless inconsistencies, its illogical entanglements, its spin like the roulette wheels where the house is rigged to win. Thank you all. So some of you have read the book. If anyone has a question or comment. Oh, wow. Okay.
How do you find this structure for your poems? How do you know when you've found that the poem is performing the way that you want it to on the page?
Performing is an interesting word. If I see that the poem, I want to get this right, if I see that the poem has forgotten about performing, then I know that it's found its place on the page. I don't think that revision is necessarily about moving words around, about exchanging this word for that word. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you need to add more. Sometimes you need to take away. But often it's about finding the right music for what's happening. And that comes from Seamus Heaney, the music of what happens. What is the music of this happening? And how does that get into conversation with the stuff of the poem? If you can find some tension there, like if that music that's happening is contradicting in some way the stuff of the poem, then you know you've taken it to another layer. There's texture that hadn't been there before. The poem has to not necessarily argue, but it has to be in conversation with something. And so the form is there to supply that friction. So it's a matter of guesswork. It's a matter of experience. It's a matter of intuition. It's a matter of practice. All of those things coming together where one day a poem falls into your lap. It seems to have come out of nowhere. Presto. But it's actually the product of years of practice. And that's why they're so rare when they're good. Yeah. Yes?
So one of the things that really found interesting in the book is that so few of the poems are about God, but God seems to arrive in so many of them towards the end or in like the last third of the poem. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship with spirituality or religion in the poems and maybe in the writing process as well?
Yeah. Make of yourself a light. That's at the center of the book. The firefly, the thing that venerates itself but also puts itself into danger from the children, including the speaker who's out to catch it, to take its light and snuff it, sometimes for the fun of it, is the danger of doing that. But it happens throughout the book an awful lot. If you've read it, there's that firefly poem. There's the one about Marie Curie's notebook, which still has to be kept in a box, in a lead box, because it's radioactive. So that is a book that's glowing from inside, and her life is a little bit like that. Make of yourself a light. It's a dangerous prospect, but it's living from your own center. That is, to me, a spiritual practice. It's not necessarily a religion, but it's a spiritual practice. And then there's the third one is the dog in a poem called "The Little Stairs of Z," which is doing the same thing. The animals kind of confront the speaker and say, "What have you done with your life? What light have you made of your life? Have you lived with integrity in this half asleep, half waking moment in the poem?" So I would say that's enough. That was enough to drive me through the entire book, and it's something that's at the center of my own spiritual practice too, along with this other stuff about paying attention. Can I just tell you one little story about that? There's a book called Journey to. It's a terrible title. Journey to Heaven or something like that. It's not the kind of book you're thinking of. It's not like I was in heaven and I'm back now. No, it's not like that. It's about the hermit tradition in China. And it came out in 1988. Boa did the book. And it's a collection of essays by a writer from Washington State who went to China right around the time of Tiananmen Square and went searching for these hermits who lived on the mountain and who had been there since before Mao. And he met a hermit who said, "I was 18 years old, it was the mid-1930s, and I had a dream. The mountain came to me and asked me to be its protector. Asked me to be the protector of the mountain. And so, of course, I went." And this person didn't know who Mao was. It was before any of that happened, and he hadn't been in contact with civilization since, and this was 50 years later. And I think of that hermit on the mountain, the protector of the mountain, doing seemingly nothing. Nothing's happening in his life from our perspective, but something is happening in that aloneness and in that infinite patience that he represents. And the interesting thing about the book is that it's paired with the image of the man with the shopping bags in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square, all by himself in front of the tank with the shopping bags. That person is representing action in the world, being active and standing up against the monolithic system. But on the other side of it, this contemplative, at the far extreme, to me, is doing something just as majestic and heroic as well. So I like to think about those contrasts. I like to think about action, of course, and being and doing things in the world. It's necessary. Dante felt that to live was to participate. It wasn't good enough to just be a poet. To live was to participate. But then there's also this other kind of going so deep into yourself that you meet everybody else, as Charles Simic says. So I think that going so deep into myself until I meet everybody else is at the heart of this collection too. So somebody had their hand up back there. Yeah?
Yeah, I was just curious. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about Hildegard von Bingen and her relationship to City of Text.
Yes. The epigraph for that section begins with Hildegard saying, part of the terror is to take back your own listening. I just love that line so much, I knew I had to get it into my book, so I put it as the epigraph to section 2. But this whole thing in section 2 with the city of texts is about learning from the masters, but then to take back your own listening and to make a choice for yourself. So it's a theme that runs through some of the poems, especially the one about my great-great-grandfather in the Civil War. But taking back your own listening is such an ambiguous and mysterious line. It can work in so many ways. We imagine that listening is to bow to a greater authority, and that by listening we'll learn something. But what is it to take back your own listening? To take back your own listening is to say, no, I'm going to be discerning about what I incorporate into my life and what I hear. I'm going to be discerning about what the truth is. I'm not going to trust, in her case, I'm not going to trust the abbots over here who are telling me that I can do this or I can do that. Hildegard's story that she goes off and creates her own monastery, basically. So there's a sense of discernment that happens after you've incorporated the influences into your life, and then for me as a poet, to take back my own listening and saying, okay, I'll use that because I need it, and the other stuff, even if it does sound like cool poetry, I don't need anymore. So that's where I was going with it. Who else? Yeah.
You were kind of talking about how this book that you just wrote was kind of a chronology in Greek, and I was just curious about the process of writing in that regard. Like, did that make this book a little bit of a different experience for you, or was the process of writing sort of a familiar thing that you held on to? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. The question is, was this journey through the processes of grief any different for this book than for other books that I might have written? I would say no. I mean, I think what happens when you're writing any book is that the stuff around you begins to trickle into your poems. And in my case, my father died in 2013 when The Most Natural Thing came out, that book of prose poems I described earlier. And then my mother died in 2014. And I and my sister were the main caregivers for them, and they both died rather young. So there was some angst. It might not have to be this way kind of angst that I was dealing with at the time. And I remember Bob Dylan saying once that he was mystified that anybody wanted to listen to Blood on the Tracks, because he was going through such a difficult time when he was writing that album that he felt that the grief must be everywhere in it, and why would anybody want to listen to that music? And to me, there is no more beautiful Bob Dylan than Blood on the Tracks. So I thought about this too. I thought if I pour all my grief into this book and be completely transparent about what I was feeling, and some of those stories are difficult for me to read from. Could the same thing happen in a book like this, where what the residue of that grief creates a kind of mosaic that writes a proper history of what I had gone through, and what we all go through. It's just the nature of life. So I don't think it's any different. I just think that there was a lot of loss surrounding the writing of these poems. Other questions? No, well, thank you all so much for your time and attention.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful reading. I've listened and I've paid attention. And I've noted the requisite references to Shakespeare and to Dylan and to Seamus Heaney. So now I feel really good, sort of officially giving you
get this
this
medal.
year's UNT Rilke Prize, this lovely, gorgeous, very green medallion.
I'm so excited.
There we go. I think Glenn has something to say too.
We have one last thing. So, a few years ago, we also started an Academy of American Poets Prize here at UNT, and it was generously sponsored by Paul Vortman. And we've been giving it for a number of years now. And what we usually do is ask the winner of the Rilke Prize to choose the poem that wins. And David chose a poem this year by someone who won also last year, who's getting used to making the walk up here. He chose a terrific poem called Jaw by Megan Arlett. And she's going to come up. She gets a certificate. There's also a secret certificate that replaces last year's in behind because the dog ate last year's certificate. So that's the last time we do it, though, right? So congratulations.